When I was around 8, Halloween was everything. That year, instead of going trick-or-treating with my mom, she dropped me off at my friend Shawn's house. Shawn and Johnny were a year older, which made me feel cooler tagging along. Shawn's place always had this eerie vibe, quiet, old parents, and a 20-year-old sister who barely noticed us, but it was also the best house for Halloween chaos. That year, I was dressed as a poorly constructed mummy, a lot of toilet paper and safety pins, and Shawn was a ninja. We started on the main street, the one with big houses and king-sized candy bars. Then, as the crowd thinned, Shawn got his usual reckless glint. "Let's hit the quiet streets," he said. "That's where people just dump candy to get rid of you." So we followed him down a narrow, overgrown lane at the edge of the neighborhood. The houses were older here, darker, quieter. Then we saw it, a pale yellow house tucked behind a thicket of oak trees, paint peeling, grass dead, no decorations at all. It didn't look festive, it looked forgotten. "I don't like it," I muttered. The air was colder here, heavy, silent. But then I saw it. One window on the second floor, glowing with a harsh blue-white light. Not the soft kind from a lamp. This one was surgical, sterile, unblinking. "See that?" I whispered. The boys followed my gaze. We stared in silence, the glow cutting through the dark like it didn't belong in this world. "They're home," Shawn said finally. "They just hate Halloween." Johnny shook his head. "So we leave." But Shawn grinned under his mask. "No, we leave a sacrifice." He pulled a Mounds bar, his favorite, from his bag. "If they take it, they've acknowledged Halloween. We win." It was stupid, but that was Shawn. And, as usual, we followed. He crept up to the porch while we stayed behind his lookouts. The boards creaked, the air stank of rot. He knelt, placed the candy on the mat, and I made the mistake of looking up again. The light was still there, but now there was a shape in front of it. A tall, motionless shadow, perfectly human in outline. Too solid to be a curtain, too still to be anything normal. It was standing there, looking down at us. I didn't need to see its eyes to know it was watching. My skin went cold. "Shawn, let's go," I whispered. "Hold on," he said. "No now." I yanked his arm. At that moment, the figure moved just a slight tilt of the head, enough to confirm it was alive. Every instinct in me screamed to run, and we did. We fled the porch, tearing through the yard, toilet paper flapping from my costume. I could feel that light on my back like a predator's gaze. We didn't stop until we hit the main street again, gasping among normal kids and car horns. "Just a shadow," Johnny panted. "Probably a statue." "It moved," I said. My voice cracked. Shawn didn't answer. He was staring back toward the dark street. Then he noticed his bag had split open, half his candy and his expensive ninja mask gone. "I dropped it," he muttered. "I have to go back." "Are you insane?" Johnny yelled. "Forget it, Em." But Shawn wasn't listening. He turned, already walking back into the dark. That pull of older kid loyalty gripped me again. "Stay close," I whispered to Johnny, and we followed him. The street felt wrong now, like the air itself resisted our presence. When we reached the house again, Shawn was crouched by the porch steps, searching frantically in the dirt. The oppressive silence was back, heavy as a held breath. "Shawn, forget it," Johnny hissed. "I saw it fall," he whispered. "It's here somewhere." I glanced at the window. The blue-white light was still glowing, but the shadow was gone. That absence was worse than seeing it. Before, at least we knew where it was. Then Shawn whispered, "Got it." He pulled his torn mask and ripped bag from a bush. Relief flickered for half a second until Johnny froze, staring at the porch. The Mounds bar was gone, but something else was there. A single, small, white object sat in the center of the mat. At first, I thought it was candy corn, but it was all white, chalky, perfectly shaped. It looked more like a tooth. It was placed exactly where Shawn's candy had been. A message. "We know you were here." The realization sank in like ice water. My legs wouldn't move. Shawn was shaking, staring at it in awe and fear. "Did they leave it for us?" he whispered. "I don't care what it is," Johnny shrieked. "Go." He yanked us both by the arms, and we ran. I didn't look back, not until we were halfway down the block. Then we heard it. A sharp clack, the sound of a latch being thrown, and the long metallic creak of a screen door opening. Whatever had been in that window was now coming out. We didn't speak. We just ran until the neighborhood lights swallowed the darkness behind us. At the intersection, surrounded by laughter and headlights, we finally stopped. The normal world had returned, but we weren't the same. We walked back to Shawn's house in silence. The thrill of Halloween had evaporated, replaced by a heavy dread that clung to our skin. When we got there, his sister barely looked up from her phone as we stumbled in. We dumped our candy, muttered quick goodbyes, and I went home with my mom, forcing a smile when she asked if I'd had fun. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that white candy corn tooth and the vacant glow of that upstairs window. For weeks afterward, the memory stalked me. Whenever I passed a dark house, I'd instinctively glance at the second-story windows, half expecting to see a tall, still figure waiting behind the glass. I wasn't afraid of monsters anymore. I was afraid of watchers, the kind that didn't move, didn't breathe, but somehow saw everything. A week later, Johnny and I were biking down the main road, trying to convince ourselves it had been nothing. It was just some old guy, Johnny said, forcing a laugh. A Halloween prank. He swapped the candy while we were running. But he didn't believe it, neither did I. He was gone from the window before we ran, I said. He was waiting for us to leave the porch. Johnny's expression changed. There's something I didn't tell you, he said quietly. When we ran, I looked back just once. He paused, swallowing hard. I saw a footprint on the porch. Just one, no shoe. A bare foot, huge, with long toes spread wide, like it had been pressed into the dirt. It wasn't there before. I didn't answer. The world felt suddenly colder. That single image, a pale footprint in the dust, was worse than the shadow itself. It meant whoever or whatever had been watching us wasn't confined to that light. It had stepped out, walked where we had been, and left its mark. After that, we never talked about it again. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. When you're a kid, terror burns hot and quick, then fades as you grow. But this one never really faded. It just settled deep inside me, dormant. Even years later, as a teenager, I'd still get that prickle on the back of my neck when I saw a house with one light on and the rest in darkness. That same shade of sterile, fluorescent blue. One afternoon, about 3 years after that Halloween, curiosity got the better of me. I biked down that same old street. It was bright daylight, leaves scattered across cracked sidewalks. But when I reached the end of the lane, I froze. The yellow house was still there, but dead. The paint was peeling in great flakes, windows coated in grime. The grass was tall and gray, and the porch sagged worse than before. There were no curtains, no decorations, no sign of life. The window, the one that had held the unblinking light, was dark. I stood there for a long time, half expecting someone to appear behind it. But nothing did. Just the wind whispering through the trees, carrying the faint smell of mildew and thyme. I turned and left without knocking. Some doors, I realized, were never meant to be approached twice. About a decade later, in my 20s, I was back visiting my parents for Halloween weekend. Johnny had moved away, and Shawn was in another city for college. But nostalgia does strange things, and one cold night, driving back from a friend's house, I took the long way home past our old trick-or-treating routes. The main street was quiet now. Most houses dark. The neighborhood older, quieter, forgotten by the next generation of kids. When I reached the old side street, I slowed down without thinking. My headlights swept across familiar oaks and crumbling sidewalks. The yellow house was still there, exactly as I remembered, rotting, silent. The porch caved in. For a moment, I almost smiled, thinking how childish my fear had been. Then I saw it. Up in the same second-story window, that light, that cold, clinical white glow was shining again. Identical. Steady. Unblinking. My heart dropped. The house had been abandoned for years. No car, no mail, no electricity lines connected anymore, according to my parents. But that light, it was back. The same as it had been that night. For a moment, I thought I saw movement, a faint shadow crossing the glow. Not fast, not sudden, just a slow shift, like someone turning to face the window. I blinked, and it was gone. When I finally looked away, the road ahead seemed endless, black, and empty. I didn't go back that way again. A few days after Halloween, a small padded envelope arrived at my parents' house. No return address. Inside was a single object wrapped in tissue paper. A piece of candy corn. White. Completely white. There was no note, no explanation. My mom thought it was a prank from an old friend, but I knew better. I didn't tell her about that night, never have. The envelope went straight into the trash. But for weeks afterward, I kept checking the porch at night, making sure the motion lights stayed on, making sure every window was shut tight. Even now, years later, I can still feel that unblinking light when I close my eyes, staring from some second-story window, waiting for another foolish kid to wander too close, to offer something sweet, and to receive something far colder in return. Because Halloween isn't about costumes or candy. It's about who or what decides to look back when you knock. It's funny the things you'll do for extra money when you're 18 and trying to save up for your first beat-up car. This happened a few years ago, when I was in my final year of high school, and it was the Halloween season. I wasn't trick-or-treating anymore, but I was fully entrenched in the whole Halloween atmosphere, which, for a teenager, means trying to get scared or trying to scare others. My friend Mike and I decided to take a temporary job working at one of those large, commercial haunted houses that pops up in a warehouse every October. It was a perfect gig. Minimum wage, late hours, and a free pass to spend every weekend night immersed in manufactured horror. Mike was the skeptic. He approached the job with a completely cynical attitude, focusing only on the paycheck. He was assigned to the clown room, wearing a grease-painted mask and wielding a plastic machete, and he treated the whole thing like an annoying chore. I, on the other hand, was assigned to the execution chamber, a dark corner where I had to play a silent, twitching victim strapped to an electric chair, and I loved the performance aspect of it. I got into the role, making my breathing shallow and my tremors convincing. The problem wasn't the fake blood or the screaming customers. It was the building itself. The warehouse was ancient, built in the 1942, and it had a history, not the kind they advertise, but the kind the long-term staff muttered about. It had been a meatpacking plant, a factory, and supposedly a temporary morgue during a massive flu outbreak decades prior. The air inside always felt cold and damp, regardless of the heat outside. The owners of the haunted house loved the building's atmosphere. They called it natural ambiance. One night, about a week into the run, the power went out. Not the whole city, just our block. It was around 11 p.m., and we were finishing a late shift. The place went from a cacophony of fake screams and electric buzzes to a deep, absolute darkness and an unnerving silence. The emergency lights were weak, casting long, sickly green shadows that made the whole place feel truly menacing for the first time. The manager, a portly, stressed-out guy named Frank, started yelling for all the actors to stay in costume and guide the few remaining customers out. Mike and I, still in our tattered outfits, started leading a small group toward the back exit. As we navigated the maze of cheaply constructed walls, passing the now silent mechanical props, the atmosphere shifted from scary to genuinely unsettling. The air felt heavy again. We reached the clown room, where Mike was supposed to have been stationed, and he paused, shining the weak beam of his phone flashlight around the empty space. "Hear that?" Mike asked, holding up a hand. I frowned, straining my ears. All I could hear was the distant, muffled sound of Frank yelling, and the faint drip of water somewhere in the rafters. "Hear what?" "Nothing." "Exactly," Mike said, lowering his voice. "The speakers. They're usually playing the creepy carnival music, even when the main power is out. They have a backup battery for the ambiance." He was right. Throughout the entire haunted house, there were small, hidden speakers, constantly playing a low-level sound loop, distant scraping, children's laughter, a woman's soft, mournful sigh. It was a subtle, psychological layer meant to unnerve. Now, all of it was completely silent. "Maybe the backup battery died too," I suggested, trying to dismiss the strange feeling of unease. "No way. Those things are industrial grade. They run for days," Mike insisted. He was the skeptic, and his sudden focus on this tiny detail made me nervous. Skeptics, once they find something they can't rationalize, become the most unsettled people. We moved on, finally leading the last group out the fire exit and into the cold night air. When we were all standing outside, Frank huddled the actors together. "Okay, the city says the power's out for a few hours," he announced, pulling a thick flashlight from his pocket. "Payroll's in the office. I need 3 people to come back in with me to grab the checks and make sure everything's secure. Mike, you, and..." Dave. Come on. Dave was one of the older, quieter actors who played the Crypt Keeper. I was relieved Frank had picked me. I was already tense enough and didn't want to go back in. Mike, however, looked annoyed. Fine, he grumbled, adjusting his smeared clown mask. Let's just get the money and go. Oh. Frank, Dave, and Mike re-entered the pitch-black warehouse, Frank's flashlight bobbing erratically. I stood outside with the rest of the crew, shivering slightly, the smell of burnt electrical wiring and warehouse dust still clinging to my costume. About 5 minutes later, a sound cut through the silence outside a sound that shouldn't have been there. It was muffled, as if coming from deep inside the concrete structure, and it was a woman's voice. Fright. Help me. It was a soft, ragged sound, followed by a slight, desperate intake of breath. It was unmistakably human, and it sounded terrified. We all froze. The few actors standing around me looked at each other, their faces pale in the ambient light from the street. Was that part of the loop? Someone whispered. No, another actor, a girl named Sarah, who played the screaming patient, said firmly. It sounded like it was coming from the back, near the storage area, and the loop is dead. Mike said so. Just as we started arguing over what we'd heard, the power flickered back on. The warehouse went from absolute darkness to a sudden, blinding array of stage lights, strobes, and buzzing machinery. The carnival music and the sound loop instantly blasted back on, a deafening wave of noise that swallowed any chance of hearing anything else. The sudden return of the fake sounds was almost more terrifying than the silence had been. Frank, Mike, and Dave emerged a few minutes later, holding the box of payroll checks. Frank was already sweating and stressed about the lost time. What was that? I asked Mike immediately, pulling him aside from the noise. The voice? Did you hear it inside? Mike frowned, peeling off his mask. What voice? I didn't hear anything. The only voice I heard was Frank yelling at me for touching the circuit breaker. No, outside, I insisted. When the power was off, it was a woman, calling for help. It sounded like it was coming from where you were, near the back of the execution chamber. Mike stopped, his casual cynicism momentarily breaking. Look, man, I told you, the whole sound system was dead. It was silent. You guys must have been jumpy from the power outage. It was probably just someone talking outside and the sound bounced funny. I looked at Sarah, who was nodding emphatically. It wasn't outside, Mike. We all heard it. It was muffled, like it was coming from inside the walls. Mike was already turning away, clearly ready to file the whole event under mass hysteria. But as he walked toward his car, he paused by the side of the warehouse, right where the ventilation unit was humming back to life. He looked back at us, and for the first time, I saw genuine confusion, bordering on unease, in his eyes. He didn't say anything. He just got into his car and drove away, leaving me with the chilling knowledge that a sound heard clearly by 4 people outside the building had been completely missed by the 3 people who were inside and standing close to the supposed source. And then there was Dave. Dave, the old crypt keeper, who had been listening to our exchange with a strange, passive stillness. As he pulled on his coat, he finally spoke, his voice dry and raspy. The building sometimes borrows voices, he said, not looking at me. When I was helping Frank move that old display in the back yesterday, I heard a child calling for Mommy, clear as a bell. It came from the wall. Frank didn't hear it either, said I was tired. I think the walls here, they're thick, but they hold more than just sound. The next day, the unease had completely settled into my bones. The power outage felt less like a system failure and more like a curtain being briefly pulled back on a dark stage, allowing a genuine horror to slip through before the fake one was restored. The incident with the borrowed voice became a low, persistent hum of unease under the manufactured terror of the haunted house. Mike, true to his nature, remained the hardline skeptic. He was so insistent that we had collectively hallucinated the sound that he almost managed to convince me it was just fatigue and the general creepiness of the building getting to us. Almost. I, however, couldn't shake the look on Dave's face and the simple, terrifying logic of the sound system being dead. The voice was isolated, unamplified, and distinctly not part of the act. The following weekend, the crowds were insane, and the stress on the actors was high. Frank had us working 12-hour shifts. The air conditioning unit in the warehouse had broken down completely, and the heat, combined with the smell of cheap latex, sweat, and moldy props, was oppressive. I was in my execution chamber, a small black-painted box with a flimsy electric chair bolted to the floor. My job was monotonous. Twitch, groan, stare at the ceiling, and wait for the strobe light finale. This particular night, I was especially deep into the role, trying to conserve energy by barely moving, making my performance hyper-realistic in its stillness. A group of teenagers shuffled in, their phone flashlights cutting through the fog. They screamed on cue with the strobe and the sound of the crackling electricity sound effect, and I went through my usual motions. A final, silent, full-body spasm, followed by total stillness. As they left and the strobe settled back into darkness, I opened my eyes. It was utterly silent again. The sound effect loop from my room had cut out. I could hear the faint, muffled screams and music from the other rooms, but my small chamber was dead. A minor glitch, I thought. Frank would be furious. I waited for the next group, and in the silence, I heard something new. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't the woman's desperate plea from before. It was much closer, and far more unsettling. It was a slow, deliberate sound of fabric dragging on concrete, followed by a faint, wet hiss of air. It came from directly behind the thin, plywood wall of my chamber, the wall that separated my small set from the rest of the dark, unused warehouse space. The area back there was just dusty concrete floor, old pallets, and spare props covered in tarps, a space strictly forbidden to us, where the real grime of the building lay. I strained against my restraints, which were just cheap stage props, easily unbuckled, but I was committed to the stillness of my role. I held my breath, listening. Scrape. A slow drag of cloth. Hiss. A breath. Scrape. Hiss. It was moving. Slowly. It was traversing the wall behind me. My heart started to pound against my ribs, an insistent drum that I was sure could be heard even over the faint, muffled music. The sound was too close, too real, and too specific to be a stray noise from the ventilation or a rat in the wall. It sounded like something large and heavy being pulled or dragging itself along the dusty floor, stopping periodically to take a shallow, struggling breath. I finally rationalized it. It was Dave, the crypt keeper. Maybe he was moving a new prop. But why was he being so quiet? And why the labored breathing? Then, the dragging stopped right at the center of the wall behind my head. It was silent for about 10 seconds, the longest 10 seconds of my life, the only sound the furious thumping in my ears. Then, from the other side of the wall, so close it felt like it was breathing on my neck, I heard a new sound, sniffing. It was a wet, heavy, focused sniff, like a dog tracking a scent, only heavier and more labored. It moved along the wood paneling, tracing the line of my body, from my head down to my chest. It was distinctly focused on me. I realized with a sudden, paralyzing terror that the creature, or person, or thing on the other side of the wall was trying to figure out where I was. It was smelling me. My psychological state immediately broke. The calm, matter-of-fact narrator in my head, the one that always insists it's just a job, it's just a building, was replaced by a primal, screaming panic. I couldn't move. I was a professional victim, strapped to a chair, and my body was now perfectly mimicking the psychological horror of being hunted. Not for an audience, but for real. The sniffing stopped right behind my ear, and then a voice came. It was not a borrowed voice. It was deep, low, and grating, like gravel being shifted. It sounded impossibly old and impossibly close. Still, here, the words were a dry, breathy accusation, a statement of recognition. They weren't meant to be part of the show. They were meant for me. My survival instinct, which had been buried under my commitment to the role, finally surged. My hands automatically moved, fumbling with the cheap buckles of the restraints. I didn't care about the act, the paycheck, or Frank's yelling. I had to get out. As my left hand found the quick-release buckle, the thing on the other side of the wall slammed against the thin plywood. Toom! It was a loud, heavy impact, shaking my flimsy chair and the entire wooden facade of the chamber. I screamed a short, genuine burst of panic, louder and more real than any of the actors' screams all night. I scrambled out of the chair, not waiting for the next group, not waiting for the strobe, and burst out of the chamber. My eyes, adjusted to the dark, immediately scanned the long, narrow corridor of the haunted house. I saw Mike at the end, having just finished his scare, standing by the entrance to the clown room. "Mike!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Mike, something's in the back." He turned, annoyed, his grease paint clown grin seeming menacing in the low light. "What the hell, man? You broke character. Get back in your chair." I started running toward him, my body fueled by pure adrenaline. "No, Mike, listen to me. I heard it. It was sniffing and talking right behind me. It slammed the wall." And as I ran, I heard it again, the heavy scrape and hiss coming from behind the wall of my chamber. Only this time it was faster, angrier, and moving in a straight line toward the open back exit of the warehouse. It sounded like something was trying to catch up to me, but was limited by a slow, dragging motion. I reached Mike, breathless, and grabbed his arm. "We need to leave now." Mike looked past me, his expression finally shifting from irritation to a confused horror. He wasn't looking at me, but at the empty doorway of my execution chamber, which I had just fled. "Dude, your costume," he whispered. I looked down at myself. My shirt, the one I had worn under my ripped, fake bloodied victim costume, was a pale blue cotton. Running across my back, from my shoulder blade down to my waist, was a thick, dark, wet stripe. It wasn't paint. It wasn't fake blood. The line was a deep, oily black, and it looked like something had been dragged heavily down my back. And it smelled. It didn't smell like blood or sweat or fake horror. It smelled intensely of damp concrete and something acrid, almost like sulfur and old meat. Mike touched the mark with a tentative finger, then looked at his hand. The mark didn't smear. It had the viscous, tacky consistency of old, thick oil. "When you ran out of the room," Mike stammered, his skepticism finally shattered by the physical evidence. "There was a dark smear on the outside of the wall, right where you said it stopped. It looked like a greasy handprint, but it was long, almost like 5 thick, dark stripes." The wall behind me was thin plywood. The thing had dragged itself up, reached over the top, and put its entire weight on the wall, leaving the smear, which then rubbed directly onto the back of my plain blue shirt, marking me. The true horror wasn't the sound or the voice. It was the physical touch, the tangible evidence that something heavy, dark, and alive had reached over the barrier and marked me as I fled. It wasn't a borrowing of a voice anymore. It was an imposition. I never went back to the warehouse. Mike and I quit that night, leaving our final paychecks behind. I threw out the shirt, but the image of the dark, oily mark across my back and the sound of the slow, dragging scrape followed by that guttural, recognizing whisper, still, here, remains the most realistic, visceral, and genuinely terrifying memory of my life. I learned that night that the truly frightening things are the ones that move slowly, are unseen, and leave behind a physical stain that no one can explain. I was 22, working the graveyard shift at a lonely convenience store on the outskirts of town, a place swallowed by silence and bordered by endless black forest. It was Halloween night, October 31st, and the hours between 2 and 5 a.m. were as still and hollow as an open grave. The store was a single fluorescent-lit corridor that smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals and stale coffee. My coworker, Cassie, was a few years older, steady and logical, the kind of person who could explain away any strange creak or flicker of light. Her calm helped, though the isolation of that place was its own kind of madness. Around 1 a.m., after the last of the commuters vanished down the highway, the store fell into its usual deathly quiet. Cassie was restocking sodas, and I was cleaning the counter when a pair of headlights swept across the windows. A dull, sickly yellow pickup truck rolled into the farthest corner of the lot, pressing against the tree line. The engine cut off, and the night rushed back in. A man climbed out broad-shouldered, heavy, his work clothes caked in grime. A baseball cap hid most of his face. He didn't look up, didn't hesitate, just walked straight toward the store, his boots crunching the gravel in the vast silence. "Trucker, probably," Cassie murmured. "Coffee and smokes. Ember so." He entered without a word, heading for the coffee machine. His movements were slow, deliberate, every gesture deliberate enough to feel unnatural. The store suddenly felt smaller with him in it. He filled his cup halfway, then drifted to the magazine rack by the front window, holding a hunting magazine but not reading. His posture was too rigid, too focused. I could feel his eyes on me, even though his head stayed bowed. The air seemed to hum with something watchful. "Can I help you find anything, sir?" I asked, my voice a little too steady. He didn't answer right away. Then, in a low, colorless monotone, "No, just thinking." He returned the magazine, came to the counter, and placed a pack of chewing gum down. As I rang him up, I noticed a dark smear on his left pant, leg thick, dried, and the color of old blood. My stomach turned. "That'll be $1.75, I said quietly. He paid in exact change, his hands rough and grimy. Then he lifted his head slightly, just enough for me to meet his eyes. They were pale, glassy blue, expressionless, like he wasn't really seeing me. They weren't focused on my face or the register, but on something behind me, the door to the back office. "You two girls work here every night?" he asked. The question was casual in words, but the tone made my skin crawl. Before I could answer, Cassie appeared beside me, her voice crisp and steady. "Yep, we keep the lights on for folks like you. Need anything else before you hit the road?" Her composure was a lifeline. The man's focus shifted, broken by her tone. He gave a slow nod. "Nope, that's all." He left without another word, his boots crunching again on the gravel, but instead of driving off, he stood by his truck for a long, silent moment, staring back at us. Only then did he climb in and pull away, swallowed by the dark highway. Cassie exhaled, shaky but trying to smile. Just a creepy trucker, probably half asleep. I nodded, but the image of that dark smear and those hollow eyes burned in my head. He hadn't looked at the coffee or the counter, he'd looked past me, into the back office. The rest of the shift passed in tense quiet. Every creak of the old building made us jump. Around 4:45 a.m., we began closing duties. Cassie counted the till while I went to grab my bag from the office. That's when I noticed it, a thin line of mud on the beige carpet by the wall. The dirt was dark and rich, the kind that clung to boots. But the man had never come past the counter. There was no reason for mud to be there. "Cassie," I said, stepping back into the light. "Did that guy ever come behind the counter?" She looked up, puzzled. "No." "Why?" I didn't answer. Back in the office, I crouched to inspect the stain. Above it, on the bottom edge of the wooden door, was a faint scratch, a fresh gouge, 6 inches from the floor. My stomach dropped. The man hadn't been looking at the door. He'd been watching something near it. He had been keeping watch. It hit me then he wasn't the real threat. He was the lookout. Something else had already been inside. The air in the office seemed to shrink around me. I felt the creeping sense of being observed, not by one pair of eyes, but by several hidden, patient, waiting. I stumbled back toward the counter. "Cassie," I whispered. "There's mud and a scratch on the door." She came to see, and her face turned white. The logic drained from her eyes. "We need to call the cops," she said, voice trembling. She grabbed the office phone, but before she could dial, a low thump echoed from the front of the store. Then a soft hiss, like air escaping. We froze. Another thump. Then the sound of something heavy pressing against the glass, slow and deliberate. It wasn't a rock. It wasn't the wind. It sounded alive, a large, soft body leaning against the window. The glass vibrated faintly with the rhythm of a slow, shallow breath. "They're still out there," Cassie whispered. I pointed toward the back office. "The steel door we can lock ourselves in." We backed into the tiny room, slamming the heavy bolt shut. The silence that followed was suffocating. No sound of movement, no cars, just the low hum of the lights and the relentless tick of the clock. Then, from above us, came a new sound. Faint, deliberate, and far too close. Something was moving across the ceiling tiles. Cassie's eyes met mine. The man hadn't been staring at the door, he'd been watching the ceiling above it. The scratching crept forward, slow and steady, until it hovered directly over us. A piece of white dust drifted down onto my shoulder. The scratching stopped. For a heartbeat, the silence was so complete that I could hear my own pulse hammering in my ears. Then crack. A ceiling tile shifted above us, and a small drift of dust fell like snow. Cassie and I stared upward, frozen. The air smelled faintly of earth and something rotten. "Don't move," Cassie whispered. The sound resumed, faster this time, a rapid scuttling, as if something was crawling directly above the office ceiling, circling us. I could picture thin, dirty hands dragging across the panels, searching for an opening. My skin prickled. Then came the worst noise yet. The ceiling bowed. The tile sagged visibly, bending under weight. And through a thin split in the plaster, I saw a bead of black glistening in the darkness. Too small for a human eye, but alive, blinking once, reflecting our own terror back at us. Cassie grabbed the crate axe from beside the filing cabinet. Her hands were trembling, but her face had gone perfectly still. I could tell she was ready to swing at whatever fell through that ceiling. The clock ticked relentlessly. 4:56 a.m. The smell intensified old blood, sweat, and meat. The tile quivered again. I clutched the bolt on the steel door, desperate to run, when a voice came from the other side. "Going somewhere, ladies?" It was him, the trucker. The same dull monotone, impossibly calm. We froze. He'd been waiting at the back door. A suffocating dread settled over me. They had planned this every step, every reaction. The man in the store, the scratching, the glass, all of it designed to corner us here. We were rats in a trap. The ceiling above us groaned again. Cassie gripped the axe tighter. The tile gave one final creak, then stopped. The scratching faded, replaced by the slow hum of the fluorescent lights. The air seemed to exhale. The smell thinned. Nothing fell. Minutes crawled by, then ring. The office phone shrilled through the silence. Cassie nearly dropped the axe as she reached for it. "Hello?" she whispered. It was Frank, the store owner, cheerful, oblivious. He was calling to check if the power had held through the night. We didn't tell him a thing. How could we? There was no proof, no sign of forced entry, no truck in the lot, no man. We clocked out in silence. The sky was turning gray as we stepped outside. The air felt different, thinner, quieter than before. But Cassie stopped suddenly and pointed at the neon Open 24 HRS sign. One of the bulbs, the small red one in the corner, had been turned outward toward the forest. It blinked steadily, like a signal, and near the trees, in a patch of dew-dark asphalt, we saw it. A single footprint. Long, bare, five-toed, fresh, human, but too large, too deliberate. Like something had been standing there, watching us leave. We never worked another night shift. But even now, years later, when I pass that old highway store, I can still see the reflection of pale eyes in the window, watching from somewhere just beyond the glass. And I know, deep down, that the trucker wasn't the hunter. He was just part of something larger, something that waits in the dark, studying how we move, how we react. That Halloween night didn't end when the clock hit 5. It's still going, somewhere out there on that endless, empty stretch of road. And sometimes, when I dream, I still hear it, the slow scratch above the ceiling, and the faint, patient breathing just beyond the light.